The worst part of driving the night shift wasn't the drunks or the cheap tippers, or even the ones who tried to run off without paying. It was the silence. Between fares, the city felt hollow. The neon lights buzzed. The occasional car rolled by. But everything felt empty, like the world had thinned out and I was the last one left. That's why I was relieved when I saw her. She stood at the curb beneath a flickering street lamp, one delicate hand raised. She wore an old-fashioned long-sleeve dress that billowed slightly in the wind, pale blue and lace-trimmed, like something from a different century. Her hair was pinned up in loose curls, a few strands falling around her face. She was beautiful, but something about her seemed off. She didn't move as I pulled up, just lowered her hand and stepped forward. Her heels clicked softly against the pavement. I unlocked the door and she slid inside, smooth and controlled. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she settled into her seat, folding her hands in her lap. Finally, she whispered, "Holloway Street, number 16. I nodded and started driving, but something nagged at me. There was no Holloway Street, not in this city. I knew the roads like the back of my hand, every alley and shortcut. I'd never heard of a Holloway Street before, but maybe she meant Holloway Avenue or Lane. I figured I'd ask when we got closer. The silence stretched between us. Then I smelled something. Faint at first, a damp, earthy scent, like rotting leaves in autumn. I turned up the vents, hoping fresh air would clear it out, but it only grew stronger. I flicked another glance at the mirror. The woman was sitting exactly as before, hands folded, expression serene. But her fingers were wrong. They looked thinner. The skin seemed looser, as if it were stretching away from the bone. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Keep driving." The smell thickened, clogging my throat, a mix of soil, mildew, and something sickly sweet. I swallowed hard. "Are you all right back there?" I asked. My voice sounded strained. She didn't answer. I checked the mirror again. She was still there, still folded neatly in her seat, but now her lips were cracked. Small, deep fissures ran across them, like dried clay. She turned her head slowly, not towards the window, not towards the road, towards me. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I forced my eyes back to the road, focusing on the dark, empty streets. This rides on me," I stammered. "You don't have to." "Keep driving," she whispered. The words sent a jolt through me. Her voice was softer now, drier, like paper crumbling. I swallowed, my throat tight. Something shifted in the mirror. Her hair. It was coming loose. Strands slipped from their pins, falling in brittle clumps onto her shoulders. Some stuck to her face, clinging like dead vines. And her skin, it was peeling away in places, exposing something dark beneath. I felt a sharp prickling sensation crawl up my spine. This wasn't happening. I was exhausted. I was hallucinating. My tires screeched as I slammed on the brakes. I hadn't even realized I was doing it. My instincts had taken over. The taxi shuddered to a stop in the middle of the empty road. My hands were gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Silence. Then a whisper. "Don't stop." I turned. For the first time, I faced her directly. And I saw her. Really saw her. Her skin was slipping, hanging in places, curling at the edges. Her lips had dried into withered strips, barely clinging to her teeth. And her eyes were black pits, hollow, endless voids that sank into her skull. And yet, somehow, she was smiling. I fumbled for the door handle. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. Get out, now!" But then she spoke again. "We're almost there." A slow, rattling breath left her lips, and she pointed. I followed her hand, trembling. Outside the windshield, just ahead, a single house stood at the end of the street. A house that shouldn't exist. I couldn't explain it. The house hadn't been there before. I knew the city. I'd driven these roads for years. And yet, There it was. A two-story Victorian, blackened with age, windows dark and hollow. The paint had peeled in long, curling strips. Ivy clung to the walls, strangling the wooden beams. The air around it felt thicker, heavier. Like the house was breathing. My body screamed at me to run, to leave the car and sprint in the opposite direction. But I couldn't move. The woman, if she could even be called that anymore, reached for the door handle. Her fingers barely looked human now. The skin had shriveled away, leaving bones wrapped in something leathery and dark. The door creaked as she pushed it open. She stepped outside. And then, for the first time, she turned fully to face me. "Thank you for the ride," she rasped. Her jaw split as she spoke, the skin at the corners of her mouth tearing, revealing blackened gums and too many teeth. She stepped back, and then she collapsed. Not like a person fainting, not like someone losing balance. She crumbled. Her body fell apart, sloughing into the ground like wet, rotting paper. The remains sank into the soil, vanishing beneath the tangled weeds. A single gust of wind rushed through the street, rattling the taxi. Then, nothing. The house stood silent. The night stretched on, empty and still. And I was alone. I don't remember driving away. The next thing I knew, I was parked outside my apartment. My hands were ice cold, my fingers still wrapped around the wheel. I stepped out on shaky legs. My skin felt clammy. My clothes reeked of mildew. I climbed the stairs, unlocked my door, and collapsed onto my bed. For hours I stared at the ceiling. Then, just as I finally started to drift into uneasy sleeping, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. A notification. A new ride request. I picked up the phone with trembling hands. Pickup location, Holloway Street, number 16. Every taxi driver has regulars, people who take the same route every night. Bartenders, graveyard shift workers, drunks who can't drive home. You get used to them, you learn their schedules. But this guy wasn't normal. The first time I picked him up, it was a little after midnight. He stood at the curb of a quiet intersection, staring straight ahead, his posture stiff. His suit was plain, charcoal gray, perfectly pressed. No tie. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides like he didn't quite know what to do with them. I pulled over, and without hesitation, he got in. "Where to?" I asked. "Home," he said. His voice was flat, toneless. I waited for an address, but none came. I turned in my seat. "I'm gonna need something more specific than that." The man's face was pale, expressionless. He blinked slowly like he was processing my words. Then he gave me an address, somewhere across town. I nodded, put the car in drive, and pulled away. The entire ride, he didn't speak. Didn't check his phone, didn't fidget, didn't breathe loudly. Just sat there, staring straight ahead. It was eerie, but I didn't think much of it. Not until the next night, when I picked him up again, from the same place, at the same time, and he said the same thing. Home. The third night, I asked him outright, "Hey man, you take cabs a lot?" He turned his head slightly. "Yes." I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Every night after that, I saw him again. Always at the same intersection, always at midnight. I started noticing small things. How he never carried anything. No phone, no wallet. How his suit never had so much as a wrinkle. How he never paid, but my meter always showed the fare as settled when he stepped out. I thought maybe he was a businessman. Maybe he had some weird taxi subscription service. But then I checked my transaction records. His name wasn't listed anywhere. It was like the rides never happened. A week passed, then two. One night I got sick of it. When I saw him standing at the curb, I kept driving. I checked my mirror as I passed. He didn't move, didn't flag down another cab, just stood there. I let out a breath. Good, maybe he'd finally get the message. That's when my radio crackled. A voice came through. Static, choked, garbled, but I recognized it. My own voice. You shouldn't break routine. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I grabbed the radio. Hello? Silence. Then a soft breath. Turn around. My stomach clenched. I didn't. I sped up, knuckles white on the wheel. But when I stopped at the next red light, the back door unlocked, and he got in. I didn't speak. I couldn't. The taxi felt wrong, full in a way that made my lungs tighten. The air was thick, heavy. I flicked a glance at the mirror. He was staring at me. For the first time, his head tilted slightly. Why did you break the routine? My hands felt numb. I don't know what you're talking about. He just kept watching me. I swallowed hard and forced myself to focus on the road. I just needed to get to his address, drop him off, and a realization struck me. I didn't know where I was driving. My hands were moving on their own, steering down unfamiliar streets. My foot pressed the gas pedal, but I wasn't thinking about it. I checked the GPS. There was no route, no map, just a single word, home. I slammed on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching. Get out, I snapped, turning in my seat. I don't know who you are or what the hell is going on, but get out of my damn cab. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. Then slowly he leaned forward. I never left. His voice sounded like mine. My blood went cold. And in the mirror, his face began to change. The smooth skin cracked, split like peeling paint. Underneath, something else was pushing through. Something that looked just like me. I threw the door open and staggered out, gasping. I expected him to follow. But when I turned, the taxi was empty. The backseat door hung open. The meter flashed, its numbers flickering rapidly before settling on one word: fare paid. The next morning, I quit my job. I got rid of the taxi, but it didn't matter. Because every night at exactly midnight, my phone rings. And when I pick up, a voice identical to mine whispers, "Home." The man waved me down just past the old highway turnoff. It was nearly 2 a.m., the stretch of road between towns empty except for the occasional passing truck. There were no houses nearby, no buildings, no reason for anyone to be out here. But there he was. His posture was stiff, his arm raised in a slow, deliberate motion. He wore a black suit, the kind that looked expensive but outdated, like something from a funeral decades ago. His face was obscured by the dark lenses of his sunglasses, even in the dead of night. I should have kept driving. But I was tired. I just wanted one last fare before I called it a night. I slowed the cab and pulled over. The man didn't hesitate. He opened the door and slid inside with an unnatural smoothness, folding his hands over his lap. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. "Keep driving," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. It made my skin prickle. I cleared my throat. Any particular direction?" He didn't answer. I sighed, put the car in drive, and eased back onto the road. The silence stretched. I kept glancing at him in the mirror, trying to get a better look at his face. Something about him was off. His skin was too smooth, like wax, no wrinkles, no pores. "Us, long night?" I asked, trying to break the tension. No response. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Listen, man, I can't just..." Then I saw it, a shift in the mirror. He had taken off his sunglasses. And beneath them, there was nothing. No eyes, no sockets, just smooth, unbroken skin. I sucked in a sharp breath. My hands jerked on the wheel, the tires skidding briefly against the asphalt. The man tilted his head slightly, like he could see me flinch, even though he had no eyes. I forced myself to focus on the road. "Listen, if this is some kind of joke, you should look." His voice crawled over my skin. I shook my head. "Look at what?" "The mirror." The back of my neck prickled. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed, "Don't." But my body wasn't listening. Some deeper part of me, some awful, twisted curiosity, forced my gaze upward. At first, I only saw myself, my wide, panicked eyes, the man sitting stiffly behind me, his face as smooth and blank as a mannequin's. Then the reflection changed. The road behind us was gone. Instead, the mirror showed a different place, a darkness deeper than night, stretching infinitely in all directions. Shapes moved in it, not people, not animals. Things, shadows with too many arms, limbs that bent in the wrong places, faces that peeled open like flowers, revealing pulsing, writhing insides. I choked on my own breath. My vision swam. I felt like I was falling into the mirror, into that impossible space. Then the man spoke again. You see it now. I couldn't breathe. My hands were still on the wheel, but my mind had been yanked somewhere else. The things in the mirror, they were watching me now. I could feel them, feel their attention pressing against me like a thick, suffocating fog. One of them moved closer. It had no face, just a hollow, gaping slit where its mouth should be. It reached for the glass. I ripped my eyes away. The car swerved. I barely managed to correct it before we veered off the road. What the hell was that? My voice came out strangled, shaking. The man didn't answer right away. He simply put his sunglasses back on. Then softly, he said, now that you've seen them, they've seen you. I wanted him out now. I slammed on the brakes, the taxi screeching to a halt. Gravel sprayed against the road. Get out, I snapped. My voice was hoarse. Ride's over. The man simply smiled. And then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he opened his door and stepped out. I didn't wait. I threw the car into reverse, my tires shrieking as I peeled away from the empty road. I didn't look back. Not until I was home, locked inside my apartment, every light turned on. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, replaying what I'd seen in the mirror. And then ding! My phone vibrated. A notification. A new ride request. Pickup location. The last place I dropped him off. Passenger. Unknown. I turned off my phone. I quit my job the next morning. But that didn't matter. Because every night since at exactly 2 ME car engine starts by itself. And the mirror keeps showing me something else.